Hello everyone, this is Jay Wengro and welcome to Think Like a Software Engineer, episode 17. In this week's episode, I'm going to show you an amazing trick when reading documentation of how to save yourself hours of time and headaches. Okay, in front of me I have the documentation of how to create a modal window using Bootstrap. A modal window is one of those pop-up windows as follows. So you've seen these before. These are called modals. I would like to add a modal window to this sample app. My goal is to make it that a modal window pops up when I click this button. Right now when I click it, nothing happens. So let's take a look at the documentation. So here there's a section called How It Works. The information here is not terribly useful, but then we have examples. So here we have an example of what a modal would look like in Bootstrap. And then here is the HTML code for creating that modal window. Below that, we have a live demo, which is cool because we can click this button and see what it actually looks like. And then we have the code below of how to create that same live demo. And then they have other live demos of various other modals. A software engineer with perhaps less experience will decide, okay, well, I know I need to make this modal window. Here seems to be the official HTML for creating that modal. So I'm going to copy it and paste it into my code base. So these 3 lines of code are where my button is for see the modal. I'll just stick the actual modal window, which is invisible at start anyway, right here. Now, if we go back here and go to our app, and refresh, right now when we click the button, nothing happens. So that at first may be frustrating, but then if we think about it, we'll realize, okay, this HTML is just the HTML for the modal window itself. It does not contain the code for triggering the modal to appear. So if we look at the live demo, we'll see that here we have not just the modal code, but also the button trigger code. So here again, the software engineer with less experience would start analyzing, okay, let's look at this sample code and see what from the sample code we would need to add to our own code. Now here, their button is using the HTML element called button, whereas our button in our code is actually this plain A tag, which is a regular link. Hopefully that won't mess us up too bad. With some experience, we'll come to realize that it's probably this data toggle and data target business that we may need to add to our code. So we'll add it inside of our A element. And now when we go back to our app and refresh, we will hope for the best that when we click the button, it will work, and it does not. So now we have to go back to the documentation. And we try to figure out, okay, what are we missing? And we'll figure out, okay, this data target # example modal is probably connecting to this ID here, example modal. And in our code, we don't have any ID that says example modal. So we'll go back and we'll figure out that we need to take this ID and then add it to our modal window. And then we go back to the app, refresh, and click it, we see that it works. So that took a few steps. But even with all this, there's actually still a flaw. Because if we look at the demo modal and click it, you'll see that there's this smooth transition. Let's look at that again. Watch as I click it, how the modal window appears. There's this nice smooth transition, and it sort of comes down a little bit. Whereas in our app, let's try this again. When I click the button, it just appears. And I would like to have that smooth transition. So I would end up going back here to the documentation and try to figure out where is the code that allows for that smooth transition. And this can be a long and frustrating experience. And this is where my tip comes in. You can avoid all of that time and all of that headache by doing as follows. Let's go back to our code and Command Z. Let's back up. to where we started. An experienced software engineer will instead do as follows. They will just say to themselves, well, this code is the live demo, and we know this works, right? When I click on this, we have a perfect modal with a smooth transition. So what I'm going to do is simply just copy and paste the entire working example and simply paste it into my app. Let's see what happens there. If I refresh the page, we now have, in addition to our original See the Modal button, we now have this blue Launch Demo Modal button. Let's see what happens when we click it. When we click it, we get our modal window with that nice, smooth transition. Okay, so this is an awesome step. We already have a working modal, fully functional, and with that awesome transition in our app. Now, while we don't want to just leave it like this because we don't want to have two buttons and we would prefer to have our active button to be the one that's white and not this blue one, but now we can go back into our code and tweak the demo code as needed. The idea here is get the demo code into your code base, make sure that the demo works in your app just as well as it did inside the documentation, and then modify that code to suit your needs. So here I'm going to modify this working code. I'm going to look at the difference between my original button here and the button from the working demo and think to myself, okay, it looks like this class is button, button large, button secondary, whereas the demo code is button, button primary. If we just replace these set of classes here, go back to our app, refresh, we now have this second button appearing how we want it. Let's make sure it still works. It still works with that smooth transition. And then we can tweak it further by changing the text to how we want it to be, which is See the Modal. Go back, make sure it works. Excellent. Go back, delete the original non-working button, refresh, test it out, and it works. So the moral of this story is that whenever documentation offers you live working examples with the associated code, the simplest thing is usually just to copy and paste the working code into your app, make sure it works in your app, and then tweak it as needed. To go the other way, which is to start with your code and then try to cram some of the sample documentation code into your code, usually is just simply a lot more difficult and time consuming. Thank you for joining me, and I hope to see you next week.